First, I'd like to thank you for displaying the Union Jack on the platform here, which is a very nice gesture to those of us who come from Britain. My presentation begins from the same points as the one that we've just heard, and the background to that is the fact that the Christian Bible comprises the Jewish scriptures, which Christians traditionally refer to as the Old Testament, and then some writings that come from the period of Jesus and just after that, which we refer to as the New Testament. But most of the allusions to lending come from the Old Testament. The first passage is the one that last presentation started from, where God says, "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor, you shall not exact interest from them." The word for interest is neshek, which literally means a bite. But there are some other passages about interest in the Old Testament that use the Hebrew words tarbit or marbit, which are cognate, I realized last night, with the Arabic word riba. These words mean increase, which I think is what riba means, isn't it? Older English translations used to understand those words to refer to usury, that is, to excessive interest. But I think that's mistaken. The texts do forbid any kind of lending at interest. What this first passage in Exodus does is tell people not to behave like lenders when they lend. In other words, they are recognizing that it's quite possible for creditors to keep the regulation that forbids lending at interest and yet still be oppressive in the way that they treat debtors. And the elaboration of that we heard about just now is an example. For instance, individual lenders aren't allowed to take the necessities of life as pledges. For instance, your ox or your ass or your garment or your millstone or your baby. There's a story about an oppressive lender later on in the Old Testament who insists on taking away a widow's children so that they can work for him because of the debt that the family is in. There's another story about a community controversy in the book called Nehemiah, which concerns oppressive lending, and that refers to people charging interest and to other tough actions such as foreclosing on loans in the community. And that gives two reasons why the problems arose. That is crop failure, but also imperial taxation. You may then have to forfeit your fields, your orchards, your houses, and end up in slavery because of debt. Though the term slavery in a way is misleading, it doesn't refer to the chattel slavery that was imposed on African Americans, but temporary indentured labour. But nevertheless, it's a form of slavery for debt that comes about because the law in Exodus wasn't obeyed. The way that imperial taxation burdens individuals and leads to debt was anticipated in the way that national taxes burden people when Israel was an independent state in Old Testament times. When, at the beginning of Israel's story, Israel didn't have kings, and they eventually asked for stronger central government at that time, and the prophet Samuel warned them about the burden that would come when they had strong central government like that, including an increase in taxation, which would mean an increase in debt and an increase in slavery. There's also an international equivalent of that. The prophet Habakkuk warns about the way in which a major international power that has behaved like a creditor, accumulating pledges from weaker and poorer countries, will in due course become the victim of its debtors. The tables will be turned. And that's an extraordinary thing for a prophet to be saying when we look at that in the context of the problem of two-thirds world debt in our own age. The passage in Exodus forbids Israelites to impose interest on poor members of my people when making loans to them. The reference to the poor indicates that the text isn't talking about what we might call regular commercial loans. And it's quite possible to imagine regular commercial loans in that context. For instance, one can imagine an ancient Israelite farmer wanting to borrow in order to enlarge his herds. The Old Testament doesn't refer to loans like that. It rather presupposes a situation in which, for instance, somebody's harvest has failed and he needs to borrow in order to feed his family and or to sow for the next year. A second passage in the teaching of Moses in Leviticus expands on the point in Exodus. It says, "If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent on you, you shall support them. They shall live with you as resident aliens. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God. Let them live with you. You shall not lend them your money at interest taken in advance or provide them with food at a profit." The passage supports the ban on lending at interest by speaking of the poor person as your kin, members of your family, and also by speaking of the need to revere God, which is perhaps a better way to translate it than to talk about fearing God. It also includes reference to lending food, which makes more explicit the kind of predicament of poor harvest that the text is designed to cope with. And the passage earns the aim of letting your kin live with you as resident aliens, that is, people who can maintain themselves even though they've had to forfeit their land. People who are doing well are expected to lend freely to the needy and to accept payment in the form of labour or the eventual repayment of the debt in money that the person has earned through labour. So debtors would seek to work their way back to solvency by committing themselves to indentured labour for a set period or to paid employment in relation to someone who did have land. It was the equivalent of getting a job rather than the norm of being self-employed. A third passage in Moses' teaching in Deuteronomy makes explicit that people mustn't impose interest on any form of loan in money or in kind. It says this, You shall not charge interest on loans to another Israelite, interest on money, interest on provisions, interest on anything that is lent. On loans to a foreigner, you may charge interest, but on loans to another Israelite, you may not charge interest. That passage then also makes explicit that Israelites are permitted to impose interest in lending to a foreigner, somebody who isn't a member of the family. It's an example of a number of obligations in the Torah that didn't apply to foreigners. It doesn't mean that usury is acceptable in relation to foreigners. But it is talking about lending on interest. And that exemption has been of considerable influence in making it possible for Jewish people to be involved in the commercial world. We don't, though, know the actual background or significance of that exemption, why that should be allowed. Maybe it does allow commercial loans to, for instance, local Canaanites or to foreigners involved in trade within Israel. Or maybe it refers to resident aliens who chose not to become full members of Israel, full members of the family. Or I wonder whether it's a purely theoretical rule. To permit loans at interest to foreigners is a way of underlining the prohibition on loans at interest to nearly all the people that anybody would be asked to make a loan to. Beyond the teaching of Moses, which is what all those quotations so far have come from, there are some other passages that refer to lending at interest, and also always in this negative way. A passage in the book of Proverbs promises that someone who makes a profit by lending at interest gathers it for another who is kind to the poor. In other words, they won't see the profit themselves. It's a personal experience of something that prophet Habakkuk envisages for the leading world power of its day, when it says that they will lose out by their imposing interest on other countries. Psalm number 15 asks the question, Lord, who may abide in your tent? That is, who may stay in your presence? And its answer includes the general requirement of a life of integrity and truthfulness, and also some concrete expressions of that, like avoiding slander and keeping oaths and refusing bribes and not lending money at interest. You can't stay in the presence of God if you lend money at interest, it says. The prophet Ezekiel speaks in similar terms, enlisting obligations that people should fulfill if they want God to treat them as righteous. And they include not worshipping by means of images, not defiling their neighbours' wives, not robbing people, and not lending an interest. Now, Ezekiel implies that people weren't fulfilling those obligations, and later he makes explicit that the well-to-do in Jerusalem have committed many of the wrongs that he lists, including this one. And that draws attention to the fact that we can't infer from Moses' teaching regarding what actually happened in the community. There are many laws in the Old Testament that the Old Testament indicates weren't actually implemented, and lots of criticisms of the community regarding such matters. To go back to where I started, Exodus 22 begins, if you lend, but it presupposes that you will lend. To refuse to lend would contravene other exhortations regarding concern for the needy. The point is explicit in that passage from Deuteronomy, which urges people to lend generously to poor members of their family. Righteous people will do well in life. Righteous people do well in life, and they're therefore in a position to give and to lend, and thus be a blessing, says Psalm 37. And Psalm 112 promises that things go well for the person who deals generously and lends. Jesus and the New Testament confirm the stance of the Old Testament without adding to it. Jesus himself refers to lending on interest only in the context of a parable about a man who entrusts his assets to his servants. And you can't infer an ethical position from parables. They start from realities of life in order to make a point about something else. Jesus does urge his followers to lend to whoever asks for a loan, and makes explicit that this applies even to enemies, and it applies even if you don't expect to gain in any way from the act. Christians have sometimes reckoned that Jesus' teaching was more radical than the teaching of Moses, but I can't see that that's the case. I think it simply confirms it. Now, I was asked to talk about Christian teaching on the subject after biblical times. I'm not really competent to comment on that. And anything that Christopher says in a minute that contrasts with what I say, he's right. But as far as I understand it, through the first millennium of the Common Era, the Christian Church simply affirmed the Old Testament principle that lending on interest was disapproved, on the continuing presupposition that lending was an aspect of care for the needy. In practice, though, lending on interest was tolerated as long as rates were not judged to be excessive. Where Christians refused to engage in commercial lending, that was when Jewish moneylenders were able to fill the vacuum on the basis of that Deuteronomic permission to charge interest to foreigners. In the second millennium, commerce began to develop in new ways, and the practice of lending on interest became prevalent, initially despite the Church's opposition. In due course, though, what the Church has been rather good at is conforming to the secular pattern in anything, and the Church came to do that too, and provided a theological rationale for lending an interest. In 15th century Italy, public pawn shops developed with Franciscan support to offer loans to the poor more cheaply than those offered by regular moneylenders, charging a very low interest designed simply to cover expenses. And in 1516, the Fifth Lateran Council approved those. As years went by, those pawn shops began also to lend for commercial purposes at higher rates. When the Protestant Reformation happened, reformers such as John Calvin didn't feel bound by the course of discussion within the medieval Catholic Church, perceived that the Old Testament was concerned for caring for the poor and not with commercial loans, and removed the ban on lending at interest, with safeguards, though the safeguards were predictably conveniently forgotten. And in due course, the Roman Catholic Church removed its ban on lending and interest. More seriously, as the capitalist world developed, it lost the idea that the point about lending is to be caring towards the needy. In Victorian Britain, the development of the cooperative movement in the context of Christian socialism and of the building society movement attempted to recover that idea that the point about lending was to be mutual and to care for the needy. In effect, the customers of the cooperative shops were the shareholders, while building societies worked by attracting safe investments from people who hoped eventually themselves to buy a house and lending the money to people who were already in a position to buy a house. A personal footnote to all this: until a generation ago, it was often difficult to get Anglican clergy in England to retire when they ought to do so, because they'd always lived in a parsonage and had got nowhere else to go. So when the church wanted to introduce compulsory retirement, it had to solve this problem. So to get clergy out of their parsonages, it began lending them the money to buy a house on interest, but at a low rate. Some implications of, or reflections or questions that arise from this story. Do we have to think separately about loans for the needy and about commercial loans? It seems clear that we have treated countries in the two-thirds world on a commercial basis when we should be thinking about them on a need basis. That in turn suggests that we need to think about whether we want to view people outside our communities or nations as aliens or as like members of the human family. The scriptural material gives membership of one's family priority over the question, how good or bad are the relationships between lender and borrower? Number 4, must we think differently about standards we as believing communities accept for ourselves and standards we press on the secular world? Of course, on the one hand, the commercial instinct is strong out there, but on the other, ordinary unbelievers often do rise to a challenge. Fifthly, the focus of the scriptural material is on the predicament of needy people. Lending is a way you care for the needy, not a way you make money. The haves share with the have-nots by lending. Lending is a means of being a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amazing.